That's what best friends are for, after all, to help, to hold you up when tragedy strikes, and to celebrate with you when life is good. But life would never be good again, and the tragedy that had arrived was a weight no friend, no matter how dear, could ever help her carry. "Riley, have you had lunch yet?" Lillian asked, her tone stern. "What did you eat?" Yeah, I had something." "You're lying. You haven't even gotten out of bed yet, have you?" her friend noted with sharp intuition. "I'm getting up soon." Lillian let out a heavy sigh. "Riley, honey, please, I understand, but—" "You don't understand!" Riley was suddenly seized by a rage so intense that her vision blurred. Breathing became a struggle, as if her throat had swollen shut and her mouth filled with a bitter taste. "No one understands! For God's sakes, don't push! Just leave me alone!" She didn't even speak the last sentence. She screamed it. Then she cut the call and hurled her iPhone into the corner of the room. An hour later, she finally dragged herself out of bed. She had to use the bathroom. Since she was already in the ensuite, she figured she might as well wash her face and brush her teeth. Riley considered changing out of her nightgown and robe into a sundress, but decided it didn't matter. As she walked past the kitchen, she glanced sideways at the fridge. Just the thought of the food Lillian had stuffed it with, takeout containers from Whole Foods, Tupperware filled with roast chicken, salads, mashed potatoes, and mac and cheese, made Riley feel nauseous. She wouldn't eat. Not today. She wandered through the house and sat on the sofa. On the walls, on the dresser, on the coffee table, his photos were everywhere. There, in that captured looking-glass world, Robert still existed. But here, in Riley's real life, he was gone. And what use was this life without him? She buried her face in her hands, waiting for the sob to come. But it didn't. She was out of tears, out of strength. She wanted nothing. Everything felt trivial, hollow, and wrong. The person she woke up for, the person she got dressed for, the person she wanted to succeed for and make proud, he was gone. He was gone. So why was she still here? Yet she couldn't just end it. If you take your own life, you'll never see him again. For those who throw God's gift back in his face, a special kind of hell is reserved, a place you can't escape, where you simply have to endure. Riley had thought about this often lately. It was unbearable to live, yet impossible to leave. A trap, a deadlock. The phone in the bedroom rang intermittently. Lillian wouldn't give up. Would she actually drive over here? Riley wondered. No, wait, she's on the 24-hour shift at the emergency vet clinic today. Thank God. She won't leave her furry patients. That was right. She could actually help them. She couldn't help Riley. Suddenly, something thudded against the glass. Riley startled and saw a pigeon perched on the windowsill. How strange. She stood up quietly and moved closer. The bird, catching sight of her, took flight into the gray American sky. His soul came to say goodbye, she whispered to the empty room. The 40th day was approaching. That's what her grandmother would have said. Her grandmother had been a woman of contradictions, a devout churchgoer who simultaneously believed in every folk omen and superstition she'd ever heard. It was a peculiar kind of faith, but it had anchored her. Riley stood by the window, staring out into the gray. They were on the 13th floor. If there was one person who never believed in bad luck or unlucky numbers, it was Robert. He had fallen in love with this apartment and the view of the skyline the moment they saw it. He didn't give a damn about the floor number. They signed the papers that day. They had only finished paying off the mortgage 2 years ago. They were supposed to be starting their golden years. There she went again, thinking about joy. Such a ridiculous, bitter concept now. Robert was gone. He'd left. He'd abandoned her. The rain began to fall, streaking the glass. She watched the neighboring brownstones, the silver glimmer of the lake in the distance, and the thousands of glowing windows behind which lived people who could never, ever grasp how utterly alone and destitute she felt. Her relationship with her parents had always been a chilly affair. Her mother viewed parenting as a checklist: keep the girl fed, make sure her clothes were clean, and ensure her boots were warm enough for the winter. Her father believed his sole duty was to bring home a paycheck from the factory. They didn't hit her, they didn't belittle her, and they never really yelled. There was never enough passion in the house for that. Their life together had been biological rather than emotional, stolid, nourishing, functional, a survival strategy, nothing more. What anyone actually felt was irrelevant. Her father, a man who never complained and never saw a doctor, had died years ago of a massive heart attack, just like Robert, both gone in an instant, without a goodbye, in the pink of health, as a neighbor had remarked at the wake. Her mother, on the other hand, had battled a laundry list of ailments: diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and brittle bones, only to pass away last year at nearly 80. Had Riley loved them? She had cared for them, fulfilling every obligation a daughter should. She had cried at their funerals, but for the life of her, she couldn't recall a single day of pure happiness spent with them. No inside jokes, no shared laughter, no fiery arguments followed by a tearful makeup, no pearls of wisdom, no kind words, no family road trips worth remembering. Nothing, just a hollow space in her memory. Of course she owed them her existence. Without them, there would be no Riley. But she had manifested, branched off, and drifted away, and they had never reached out to hold her back. She had always been alone, if you didn't count Lillian, but they hadn't met until they were at the University of Chicago. Until Robert arrived, Riley had known what it meant to love, to be needed, to know that someone actually cared how she slept, how she felt, or what she thought about a particular novel or a new indie film. She had fallen into Robert head first, like plunging into the Pacific, and she had drifted on those warm, sun-dappled waves for 34 years. She had first seen him on campus when she was an 18-year-old freshman, and she hadn't taken her eyes off him since, and he never took his off her. They married shortly after and had been inseparable ever since. He was 4 years older, already working while she finished her degree. Robert was a journalist, a storyteller who wrote for various magazines and papers. She used to feel a swell of immense pride whenever she saw a byline with his last name, which, of course, was her name, too. Riley was an accountant. The world of spreadsheets and tax codes didn't bore her, but it was grounded, ordinary. Robert, though, Robert was the star. They lived for each other, people used to say, and it was true. They never had children. At first, it was a choice. They were enough for one another. Later, when they tried, it just didn't happen. After 4 years of hitting that brick wall, countless blood tests, specialist appointments, and fertility cycles, they reached a conclusion: if it wasn't happening, it wasn't meant to be. They were a duet, a perfectly synchronized dance, and they realized that moving in such harmony was a rare gift not granted to everyone. Secretly, though she never breathed a word of it to anyone, Riley felt a sense of relief when the quest for parenthood ended. She feared a child might have broken their rhythm. What if something irreparable happened? What if they grew tired, started fighting, and drifted apart? There was no room in her heart for anyone but Robert. He reigned there absolutely. How could she have managed to love someone else? How could she have endured sharing him with anyone, even a child? No, it was for the best. The years blurred by. They paid off the house, traded in SUVs, went on vacations to the coast. While friends and colleagues complained about their spouses, cheated, divorced, and remarried, her bond with Robert never faded. It didn't get lost in the mundane shuffle of the week. They had the one thing everyone else seemed to be missing: harmony, love. And that was exactly why, now that she was a widow, Riley had lost her footing. She had no idea how to move. Solo skating was not her genre. She had spent over 30 decades as part of a pair. It was too late to relearn how to balance on her own. Her feet felt like blocks of ice. Riley looked down and realized she was standing barefoot on the hardwood floor. It wasn't May, it was December. Even if it was raining instead of snowing, it was still winter in the city. The last thing she needed was to get sick. She retreated to the sofa, tucking her feet under her body to try and find some warmth. December is the cruelest month. It's the holiday season, and how are you supposed to believe in Christmas miracles when your own miracle has been snatched away? What is there left to celebrate? Riley saw only a blur of gray, lonely days ahead. Her firm had granted her bereavement leave. She was highly respected there, a senior analyst, a key player. Her boss was patiently waiting for her to return to the fold, but she couldn't fathom how she would ever look at a spreadsheet again. "Riley, you need professional help," Lillian insisted during one of her many check-ins. "I'm saying this as a doctor, even if my patients have 4 legs and fur. Let's find you a therapist. You aren't the first person to lose a husband. There are clinical stages to this, methods to cope." "I don't want a method. I want Robert. Can your doctor bring him back? No? Then he can take his methods and shove them." One of her colleagues had the nerve to suggest at the funeral reception that Riley was still young, barely into her 50s, and might eventually find someone else. Riley didn't cry. She became hysterical. She laughed in the woman's face. Who could possibly compare to Robert? After a lifetime with a man like him, the very idea of a replacement was a joke. She remembered the time her mother needed specialized treatment at a rehab center upstate. The doctors had been adamant, "It's crucial, she can't do this alone." Riley was drowning in year-end audits and couldn't get away, but Robert, being a freelance writer, could work from anywhere. He didn't hesitate. He spent 2 months living in a lodge near the facility, surrounded by pine trees, driving Riley's mother to her physical therapy sessions every single day. They were rarely apart for long. Aside from that trip, there was only one other time. Robert had been commissioned for a series of long-form articles about a remote town in Alaska, and he had to go. Riley's firm wouldn't let her take the time off, so they spent every day texting, calling, and aching for one another. Riley had promised herself then that they would never be separated again. And yet, here they were. When Riley had been hospitalized for a month a few years back, Robert had visited every single day, even renting a room at the Marriott adjacent to the medical complex just to be near her. When Tasha, Riley's favorite cat, fell ill, he was the one who drove her to the vet twice a week for treatments. Riley had been tied to the office, tethered to her career. Yes, it brought in a high 6-figure income, but now Riley cursed every hour she had ever spent away from her husband. She hadn't even been there when he died. He had traveled to a small town called Oak Creek for a feature story. Riley loathed the very sound of the name now. He had stopped for lunch at a local diner, felt a sudden pain, and collapsed. The people there had scrambled, an ambulance was called, but he didn't even make it to the ER. The phone rang again. This time, Riley decided to answer. Of course, it was Lillian. No one else would dare call. Riley had blocked all unknown numbers, and her colleagues knew to stay within the confines of Slack or email. "Why aren't you picking up? I'm losing my mind over here." Lillian had been divorced for years. Her son lived in Seattle with his wife, and their relationship was distant at best. In a way, Lillian only had her patients, her 2 cats, Cleo and Sophie, and her best friend. Of course she was worried. Riley felt a sudden pang of guilt for her behavior. "Lil, I'm sorry. You know how it is. But I'll try. I'll try to keep it together." "That's my girl. Listen, I've been thinking, you need to occupy your mind. You always said Robert was planning to write a book and he had mountains of notes. What if you started going through them? You might not finish the book for him, but there could be material for articles you could send to his editor. Get his affairs in order. It's what literary widows do." Riley turned the thought over in her mind. She hadn't touched Robert's papers. She hadn't even peeked at his laptop or the drawers of his mahogany desk. They never used passwords to hide things from each other. There were no secrets, and she knew that if she had ever asked, he would have shared his drafts in a heartbeat. The more she thought about it, the more the idea of curating his legacy appealed to her. It made him feel less gone. "Are you still there?" Lillian asked, her voice tight with worry. "Did I say something wrong?" "Lillian, you're a genius," Riley said, and for the first time since the day in Oak Creek, she felt the ghost of a smile. She didn't wait. She went to work immediately. Their home was a spacious 3-bedroom apartment, a living room, their master suite, and the study. Since Riley never worked from home, choosing instead to stay late at the office, the study had become Robert's kingdom in their shared library. His desk sat right by the window, his iMac waiting in sleep mode. Riley started with the hard copies in the drawers. Her husband had been meticulous. Every long-form piece, every investigative report, every interview transcript, and even the tiny human interest blurbs he'd written earlier in his career were clipped, numbered, and filed by date. Riley flipped through the pages, reading snippets, remembering the weeks he'd spent chasing this lead or that story. She didn't even notice the sun dipping below the skyline. By the time she looked up, it was almost 8 o'clock. Time had actually moved. She hadn't spent the afternoon sobbing or spiraling. She felt almost productive. For the first time in weeks, she felt a genuine spark of hunger. With a silent thanks to Lillian, she finally walked to the kitchen to eat. She went back to Robert's papers. The bottom drawer was dedicated to the blueprints of his future book. Outlines, research materials, factual references, and rough drafts. Riley began to read, her heart fluttering with the anticipation of discovering a hidden masterpiece. However, she was forced to admit a harsh truth. Her husband had been a brilliant journalist, but he possessed absolutely zero talent for fiction. The prose was dry, the plot was muddled and vague, and the metaphors were painfully cliché. The characters spoke like news anchors reporting the weather and were indistinguishable from one another. After finishing the 10 chapters he had managed to complete, Riley found herself relieved he hadn't written more. Out of love for him, she would have forced herself to keep reading, but she had no desire to. Had this manuscript belonged to anyone else, she would have tossed it into the trash without a second thought. But it's only a rough draft, she thought, feeling a wave of guilt. She tried to justify his lack of literary flair, all while knowing she would never have tried to publish this even if it were finished. She tucked the drafts back into the drawer, certain she would never open them again. There were no unfinished articles left to polish. The dream of being the widow of a literary giant had evaporated. With the physical documents exhausted, Riley turned her attention to his iMac. On his hard drive, everything was organized with the same surgical precision. Folders for various magazines, an electronic archive, photos, spreadsheets for royalties and tax returns. There was a file for contacts and a master list of passwords. Robert had been as transparent as a mountain stream, as businesslike and composed as a diplomat. She was about to shut down the computer and go to bed when she spotted a file she hadn't noticed before, titled "Just in Case." Probably more research notes, she thought as she clicked it open. But the document contained only 2 lines, an email address and a password. Intrigued, she entered the credentials and logged in. The inbox was virtually empty, save for generic spam and promotional ads. The sent folder was a 0. How strange. Why did Robert need this account? Just in case, she whispered, chiding herself. It was likely just a backup recovery email. Then her eyes drifted to the drive icon. Her hand moved almost of its own accord. Perhaps there was something stored in the cloud. Riley was right. With his characteristic pedantry and his habit of documenting every event, Robert had recorded everything. Of course, it had never occurred to him that his wife would see this. Whoever plans to die so suddenly that they don't have time to scrub their digital trail? Everyone knows the line about how life can end in an instant, but no one ever thinks it applies to them. There, laid out before Riley, was Robert's secret life. The folder contained 19 individual files, each one a detailed chronicle of a different episode from his hidden world. Her devoted husband had been unfaithful for decades. His affairs had begun as early as their 3rd year of marriage, and the most recent woman had appeared just 2 months ago. She was the reason he had gone to Oak Creek. She lived there with her husband. The poor cuckold was supposed to be away on a business trip, and Robert was meant to slip in. He had been sitting in that diner, killing time, because he'd arrived too early.
The Romances of Robert. That's what the folder should have been named. Riley opened one file after another, reading through the digital wreckage of her marriage. Robert had documented everything with disturbing clarity: the rendezvous spots, his sensory impressions, and the intricate maneuvers he used to mask his tracks from his wife. It became sickeningly apparent that he drew as much pleasure from the thrill of the hunt, the atmosphere of secrecy, the adrenaline of the lie, as he did from the acts themselves. It was all so cinematic, so noir. He couldn't write a decent novel to save his life, yet he had lived a series of pulp thrillers, masterfully directing his own double life. He had talent, after all, just not for the page. She clicked on a folder from a few years back. It turned out that during those 2 months he spent among the pines, supposedly playing the saintly son-in-law to her mother, he had managed to juggle 2 separate flings, a massage therapist and a floor nurse. Neither woman knew the other existed. And his wife? His wife had spent every night on the phone thanking her dear Robert for his sacrifice. Then there was the Alaska trip. It appeared the timing hadn't been dictated by the magazine at all. Robert had specifically scheduled the trip to coincide with Riley's Q4 audits, ensuring she'd be chained to her desk in Chicago while he brought along a camera operator, a strikingly attractive, uninhibited girl half his age. Even her month in the hospital hadn't been sacred. While Riley lay in a recovery ward, Robert was using the adjacent hotel to meet with a female physician. That affair had been intense, lasting 7 months. Robert had recorded, with a touch of frustrated ego, how much effort it had taken to shake her off afterward to prevent a scandal that might reach Riley's ears. Medical professionals of all stripes seemed to be his type, and in his mind, veterinarians were clearly part of that guild. It didn't matter if the patients had fur or a pulse, the white coat was the draw. As she hovered over file number 4, Riley already knew what was waiting for her. "So you were treating Tasha, were you? You son of a bitch," she whispered to the screen. A desperate thought flickered in her mind. Maybe this is a prank? Maybe Robert, knowing how much she would suffer if he died first, had fabricated this entire digital confession to make her hate him. Maybe he wanted her to stop mourning. He was a writer, after all, even if he was a mediocre one. He'd spun a web of lies to save her from grief. Yes, that must be it. I'm such a fool. Riley almost clung to that life raft of a lie, but her hand reached for her iPhone and she dialed Lillian. "Hello? Riley? Is everything okay?" Lillian's voice was thick with sleep and immediate panic. Of course, it was 2 a.m. No one calls at 2 a.m. with good news. "Lillian, did you and Robert—" The words felt like jagged glass in her throat. She couldn't finish the sentence. How did you find out?" Lillian's voice was a barely audible ghost of a sound. Riley didn't answer. The silence stretched until Lillian broke, her words stumbling over one another in a frantic rush. It was a long time ago, Riley. It was right when my divorce was finalized. I was a wreck. I was completely broken. My son was acting out. I felt so alone. And Robert, he made it feel like I was taking my power back. No, I'm not making excuses. I know what I did. But it ended so fast. I never, ever did it again. We didn't.
Riley knew it had been his shortest affair, only 2 weeks long. Once Tasha recovered from her feline respiratory infection, the necessary trips to the clinic stopped. Robert had noted in his logs that his relationship with Lillian had turned sour afterward. In fact, he seemed amused by it. It made sense now. They had never quite clicked. It had always pained Riley that the two most important people in her life seemed to dislike each other. She had often asked Lillian, and then Robert, what the problem was, but they both brushed it off, making her feel like she was just imagining things. "How? How did you find out?" Lillian sobbed through the phone. "You're the one who told me to look through his files, Lil, so I did. My God, he documented everything, every detail." Lillian let out a muffled gasp of horror. "Don't worry," Riley said, her voice turning cold and sharp. "Your file is only a couple of pages, a minor footnote. There are others that go on for 40 pages. "What?" Lillian stammered, caught off guard. "You're listed as number 4. There are 19 in total. Over the course of our marriage, my husband cheated on me with 19 different women. Impressive, isn't it?" The silence from Lillian's end was heavy with shock. While I was living in my glass castle of a perfect marriage, he was apparently helping himself to anyone he wanted. Poor guy died before he could make it to 20. He was actually on his way to see one of them the day he died. I just don't get how he managed them all. He never slipped up. Well, with you it was easy. He could call you in plain sight. But the others? He didn't even have a passcode on his phone. He must have had a burner. "What does it even matter now?" Lillian choked out. Riley couldn't tell if her friend was truly drowning in guilt or if she was just stung by being assigned a serial number. Honestly, it didn't matter. "Right. Well, Lillian, don't come over anymore, and don't call me. I'm throwing out all those Tupperware containers you brought. You'll have to buy yourself some new ones. Give my best to the cats." She hung up and added Lillian's number to her blocked list. If she thought about it objectively, Lillian was a victim of Robert's manipulation too. She had clearly suffered and eaten herself alive with remorse for years. But it didn't change anything. Riley couldn't look at her, let alone talk to her. Not now, maybe not ever. She stood up and paced the apartment, her eyes lingering on the framed photos of her late husband. They say there's a thin line between love and hate, but Riley didn't cross that line into hatred. What she felt was pure, cold contempt. 30 years of her life had been steeped in lies, bold, mocking, shameless lies. She wanted those years back, but you can't refund a lifetime. The thief had escaped his punishment. He'd retreated into a grave, but he'd escaped nonetheless. He had lied. He hadn't loved her. Could you call it love if it was built on such cruelty? He had robbed her of her grief. How was she supposed to mourn him now? Her entire life turned out to be a cheap vaudeville act, a bad B-movie, a trashy supermarket romance novel. But then a different thought took hold. Riley began taking Robert's portraits off the walls. She swept the silver-framed photos off the desk and the dresser. She went to the kitchen, grabbed a box of heavy-duty hefty bags, and began shoveling his entire archive, the files, the notes, and that pathetic excuse for a manuscript, into the trash. On the bright side, if she hadn't learned the truth, she might have followed Robert into the dark out of pure, unadulterated grief. That would have been a truly pathetic death. Now? Yes, it hurt. It was bitter and humiliating. She felt like a fool, betrayed in the deepest sense. But this was something she could survive. She could process this. Time would eventually dull the edge. That colleague at the reception had been right. 50-something isn't actually that old, especially in this city. In a strange, twisted way, the world had just opened up. There was still time to start over. There was still time to find a life that was actually real.